Luke is reporting to us how the disciples were instructed to wait in Jerusalem until the Holy Spirit came upon them, and then they would be witnesses to Jesus in all the world, beginning in Jerusalem, then Judea, Samaria, to the ends of the earth. And so when the day of Pentecost came, 7 weeks after the resurrection of Jesus, they were gathered together with one accord, in unity, worshipping God, when at 9 o'clock in the morning there was the sound of a rushing mighty wind. And as they looked up, they saw the Holy Spirit in a form that looked a bit like tongues of fire, dividing and settling on each one of them. And as it settled on them, it prompted them to speak of the wonderful works of God, speaking languages that they had never learned. They went out on the street, and people gathered to hear this babble of sounds. As maybe 120 people are speaking 120 different languages, people said, "Hey, he's speaking my language. But he doesn't come from my village. He's from Galilee. How could that be?" Well, it shows that God is now reaching out to the nations, all the different nations of the world, in all the different languages of the world. The Christian message doesn't require everyone to learn to speak Greek or Hebrew even. The message is translated into the languages of the world. And this can be done because of the nature of the Christian message. It is a message conveyed in stories about things that people have done. So you can tell the story in a different language without losing the essence of the story. It's not the particular words in a particular language that then matter, but the fact that the message is conveyed. We need to be very careful in our translation to properly convey the message from one language to another. But we do convey it in the new language, with the particular nuances of the new language, because it was not just that they were speaking Greek, but they were speaking all of these various dialects, the languages that people had learned as children. And in that babble of sound, the people were able to recognize people speaking their own language and understand what they were saying. What could this mean? Those who grew up in Jerusalem didn't know these other languages, and so they said, "Oh, they're just drunk, they're just mumbling." But those who came from the various countries recognized their own language in the midst of all the sounds. Now the next thing that's remarkable is that Peter is ready with an answer, even though the Holy Spirit has just come upon him. And so Peter, standing up with the 11, raised his voice and said to them, "Men of Judea and all who dwell in Jerusalem, let this be known to you, and heed my words. For these are not drunk, as you suppose, since it's only the 3rd hour of the day. But this is what was spoken by the prophet Joel. And it shall come to pass in the last days, says God, that I will pour out my Spirit on all flesh. Your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. Your young men shall see visions. Your old men shall dream dreams. And on my men servants and on my maidservants I will pour out my Spirit in those days, and they shall prophesy. I will show wonders in heaven above, and signs in the earth beneath, blood and fire and vapour of smoke. The sun shall be turned into darkness, and the moon into blood, before the coming of the great and awesome day of the Lord. And it shall come to pass that whoever calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved." Men of Israel, hear these words. Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested by God to you, by miracles, wonders, and signs, which God did through him in your midst, as you yourselves also know. Him, being delivered by the determined purpose and foreknowledge of God, you have taken by lawless hands, have crucified, and put to death, whom God raised up, having loosed the pains of death, because it was not possible that he should be held by it. For David says concerning him, I foresaw the Lord always before my face. For he is at my right hand, that I may not be shaken. Therefore my heart rejoiced, and my tongue was glad. Moreover my flesh also will rest in hope. For you will not leave my soul in Hades, nor will you allow your Holy One to see corruption. You have made known to me the ways of life. You will make me full of joy in your presence. Men and brethren, let me speak freely to you of our patriarch David, that he is both dead and buried, and his tomb is with us today. Therefore, being a prophet, and knowing that God had sworn with an oath to him, that of the fruit of his body, according to the flesh, he would raise up the Christ to sit on his throne, he, foreseeing this, spoke concerning the resurrection of the Christ, that his soul was not left in Hades, nor did his flesh see corruption. This Jesus God has raised up, of which we are all witnesses. Therefore, being exalted to the right hand of God, and having received from the Father the promise of the Holy Spirit, he poured out this which you see and hear. My name's Arthur, and I thank you for joining me as we share together Peter's address to the men who were gathered in Jerusalem, both the visitors and those who dwelt there. We've read Acts chapter 2, verses 14 to 32. They were looking for an explanation. What does this mean? And so he is speaking with their permission. He had heard that some were saying they're full of new wine. He's saying, no, it's not new wine. It's only 9 o'clock in the morning. This is what the prophet spoke about in the Old Testament, and so he quotes the prophecy of Joel from chapter 2. In the Old Testament, the Holy Spirit came upon a few individuals, but was not generally upon the whole nation. But the Old Testament contains the prophecy in several places that in the last days God would pour out his Spirit on all flesh, that many more people would experience the Holy Spirit in their lives. And in Joel we have the consequence of this. Your sons and daughters shall prophesy. It will not just be a few prophets who prophesy, but many people will be speaking the wonderful works of God. This is what many people will do under the influence of the Holy Spirit. Young men will see visions, old men shall dream dreams, and on my men servants and on my maid servants I will pour out my Spirit in those days, and they shall prophesy. Ordinary people under the influence of the Holy Spirit will speak out the message of God. They will declare, they will prophesy, they will speak out God's message. The point of speaking out the message is that so others can believe. For the quotation that we have ends with, it shall come to pass in those days that whoever calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. So we have his servants declaring the wonderful works of God, and people responding by calling upon the name of the Lord. But in the middle, Joel and Peter say, I will show wonders in heaven above, and signs in the earth beneath, blood and fire and vapour of smoke. The sun shall be turned into darkness, and the moon into blood, before the coming of the great and awesome day of God. Some very dramatic things are going to happen throughout history, which will prompt people to ask why are these happening, and will make them willing to respond to the message of his men servants and maid servants, culminating with things like the sun being turned into darkness and the moon into blood. The establishment of the church and the Holy Spirit coming upon believers is the beginning of the fulfillment of this prophecy. We're in that period of time where whoever calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. This is all happening before the coming of that great and awesome day of the Lord, the day when the Lord himself shall descend and establish himself as king over the earth. But what the men of Jerusalem are witnessing is the fact that God has now poured out his Spirit on the earth, on his men servants and on his maid servants, enabling them to speak the wonderful works of God, so that whoever calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved.